Hey everybody, this is going to be a fun one. We're going to talk about nitric oxide and how that relates to Viagra, which everybody knows what that does. But first, let's do a little exercise. Just let's everybody join me in a little humming. What does that have to do with anything? Well, turns out that humming increases levels of nitric oxide in our body as much as 15 times. That is important, and it explains why all of these, really happy and high-functioning monks love chanting and oming. So all you have to do is hum, and you can get the same sort of effects as, say, for example, Viagra. Because what does Viagra do? It increases nitric oxide to the erectile tissue in the male genitalia. They've actually also experimented with using it with women. I guess it does have a similar effect. But what's also interesting is that we have erectile tissue in our nose. And depending on the time of day, that erectile tissue hardens and softens on either side, changing the side of the nose that we can breathe on. So we can also kind of hack that, and many people who do yoga might be aware of this already. So what actually happens is if we breathe only through the left nostril, that is associated with a calming effect that also can stimulate creativity. So plugging the right nostril and breathing through the left. And then we have the opposite. If we plug the left nostril and breathe through our right, that can increase our body temperature and our heart rate and improve circulation. So might not hurt to do both. And our body's already doing this during the day, switching from one side to the other, where sometimes they might both be open, but typically from one point or another, one or the other is going to be constricted. Okay, so back to nitric oxide. So nitric oxide, obviously important, and as demonstrated by all of the middle-aged and older men in America, if we don't have enough nitric oxide, we lose some important functions and some of our ability to enjoy the finer things of life. But that being said, what might be contributing to this? Well, let's look at the research. So here we have retinoic acid. Remember, this is a metabolite of vitamin A. So all vitamin A we're consuming eventually gets turned into retinoic acid on the way out of our body. It inhibits nitric oxide synthase 2. This is an enzyme that our body uses to make nitric oxide. So inhibiting that, if we want more nitric oxide, probably not a good idea. Why would some people be so deficient in nitric oxide? Maybe this is a key. Okay, well, what else? Oh, look. It does this in the vascular smooth muscle. What's the vascular smooth muscle? That's our heart and our arteries. What else happens to men who may need Viagra? Heart disease. Okay, so now we know nitric oxide, good. Nitric oxide synthase being inhibited by retinoids, bad. What else happens? Well, so let's see here. We have dopaminergic neurons. So neurons that make dopamine, they utilize nitric oxide. So we need nitric oxide in our neurons in our brain that produce dopamine. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, what else happens here? So we can look at this and we can see that the retinoic acid receptors, if they're stimulated, it protects midbrain dopaminergic neurons. Isn't that interesting? So if the retinoic acid receptors are stimulated, It causes our body to upregulate brain-derived neurotropic factor expression. And this BDNF is what signals to our brain to produce new neurons. So, but what's interesting here is that even though we call these retinoic acid receptors, right here in this paper, they are activating these retinoic acid receptors with something else called AM80, which is not a retinoid. So this goes to show you that though we're calling them retinoic acid receptors, other ligands or things that can activate them can and will activate them. So they're using this other thing called AM80 to increase BDNF expression. Okay, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Okay, it's a nerve growth factor, and it increases or improves neurogenesis in the brain. Sounds pretty important, especially since neurodegeneration is such a big problem in the modern world, right? So now we've addressed heart disease and neurodegenerative disease. Okay, so again, back to what are ligands and what are other ligands that work on the RARs, right? Well, this paper talks about one of them being melatonin, okay? And you can see here too is that all these different types of cholesterol, including keto cholesterol. Look at all these other different types of things that can activate these retinoic acid receptors, including retinoic acid. So why do we call them retinoic acid receptors when they could very well be called cholesterol receptors? It's a good question. And what else? Oh, saturated fatty acids also activate these receptors. And they can suppress tumorigenesis. That means tumor production, okay, by targeting fatty acid binding protein 5. Okay, so now let's look at this paper. Okay, so both saturated and unsaturated long-chain fatty acids, okay, bind to this fatty acid binding protein 5. However, saturated fats inhibit, unsaturated fats activate this pathway. Okay, why is that important? Well, let's take a look. What happens when we activate this pathway? Okay, so fatty acid binding protein 5, okay, regulates cognitive function by decreasing anandamide levels. Okay, what is anandamide? Anandamide is omega-6. Okay, it's a very important neurotransmitter. Okay, and if we look at, physiological functions of this, it has to do with cannabinoid receptors. Okay, so let's connect some dots. We have too much unsaturated fat in our diet. Dun, 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 dun. That upregulates this pathway. Dun, 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 dun. That decreases anandamide levels. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, it looks like they are the same receptors are sensitive to tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, and other cannabinoids. Right now, we have in our health and wellness world this incredible, I would say, epidemic of people who require cannabinoids to function or feel well or to, treat all these various diseases. So what might really be happening here? Well, we may have really messed up our metabolism with excess retinoids, decreasing nitric oxide, too much unsaturated fats, plant fats, downregulating, decreasing omega-6 anandamide, and creating deficiencies here. And if you look up those deficiencies, you might notice you have a lot in common. Okay? And you'll see here too is that it has a lot to do. It's important for implantation of early stage embryos in the uterus. Okay? So it affects ovulation, estradiol, and viability of the fetus. Okay? Plays a role in regulation of feeding behavior. Okay? Neural generation, so healing of the brain. but also with motivation and pleasure. Got a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression as well in the world right now. And look at this, when they injected anandamide directly into the forebrain, right? Whoops. Right, this is activating the pleasurable responses of rats, right? And it's related to the beneficial effects of the runner's high. Okay? And look at this. Anandamide inhibits human breast cancer cell proliferation. So it probably is inhibiting cancer in anywhere in the body, right? But if we're inhibiting it through this chain of events, we're going to have problems. And look at this. Sure enough, when we activate this fatty acid binding protein 5 in the pathway, we promote breast cancer cell proliferation and tumorigenesis. So, think all those monks chanting Om are silly still? Maybe not. Maybe there's something to it. Maybe there's something to a lot of this stuff. I hope you found this helpful and informative, and Om to you.